Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm Almazroua. I'm a fourth-year medical student. And today, inshallah, I'll be explaining to you cardiac cycle and pressure volume loops. This lecture is actually very interesting. Inshallah, once you understand it, it gets so easy. Maybe in the beginning, it might seem as if it's complicated, but trust me, it gets so easy once you understand it. And inshallah, you'll be able to solve all the questions. So I'm going to start by explaining some basic principles that I want you to understand before we go into the lecture. So now when we're talking about the heart, as you know, we have four chambers. We have the right and left atrium. Excuse me for a second. I just need to mute my WhatsApp so it doesn't disturb you guys. Just 1 second. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so we know we have four chambers in the heart. So we have two atria and two ventricles. And can someone tell me which one of these chambers receives like all the oxygenated blood from our body? Like which one of these chambers, the right or left atrium, right or left ventricle? So it's just a very basic question. So I get you like engaged. The right atrium, exactly. So the right atrium is the chamber of the heart that receives the blood from everywhere. So that's something to keep in mind. But also the left atrium receives blood from our lungs, and that's like something to also keep in mind when we're talking about the cardiac cycle. So just briefly, I'm going to tell you what's exactly happening in the heart. I'm sure you already know, is that blood just goes to the atrium, the right and left atrium. And then from the right atrium, the deoxygenated blood would move to the right ventricles. And then the right ventricles would pump the blood into the lungs where it gets oxygenated and then goes back to the left atrium. And then it goes down to the left ventricle and then it's pumped to our entire body. So yeah, that's what's happening normally. Now, when it comes to the cardiac cycle, we're going to see what's exactly happening in details within the heart itself. So another important principle in that aspect is that contraction increases the pressure within a chamber and relaxation lowers it. And it makes total sense. Like the chambers are not contracting the entire time. So sometimes the atria is contracting and the ventricles are not. Sometimes the ventricles are contracting and the atria are not, and so on. So whenever a certain chamber is contracting, I want you to like link it in your head that, okay, this means that it's having more pressure, and it makes total sense because when a chamber is contracting, it generates pressure. Now, the AV valve or the atrioventricular valves, they open whenever the atrial pressure exceeds the ventricular pressure. So basically, what determines the blood flow, the one that I just said earlier, like from the atria to the ventricles and so on, is the pressure gradient. So we need the pressure gradient in order for the blood to flow within the heart. And in the aspect of the blood moving from the atria down the ventricles, the pressure in the atria has to be higher or it has to exceed the ventricular pressure in order for the blood to move down the ventricles. That's one principle. The other principle is that the semilunar valves, which are the aortic and the pulmonic valves, they only open whenever the ventricular pressure exceeds the arterial pressure, or like the pressure within the aorta or the pulmonary trunks. So we need like pressure gradient in order for blood to flow. And this like kind of makes sense because otherwise blood wouldn't be able to flow. So it goes from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. Now, throughout the cardiac cycle, I'm going to be saying systole and diastole frequently. So let's get it from now and understand what they mean. So systole generally means it is contraction. Diastole is relaxation. So whenever the ventricles are pumping blood or like they're contracting, that's what we refer to as part of systole. And whenever they're relaxing and filling with blood rather than pumping it, that's what we call diastole. And generally speaking, unless otherwise specified, whenever I say just systole, I'm referring to ventricular contraction. Unless, for example, I say atrial systole and I specify that it's atrial, that's when I'm talking about the atrial. But generally speaking, whenever someone says systole without any other specific words, they're referring to the ventricles. Are the basic principles clear for now? I just want to make sure that you understand them so we can go into the cardiac cycle. Clear? Okay, perfect. Now we're going to move to some ECG basics. This is not the lecture for ECG. You have another lecture for it, but I'm just going to explain some basic information that you probably already know, but kind of a reminder so that you correlate it with the cardiac cycle. So if you look here, let me just use my pointer, 1 second. Um, Okay. So here we have the P wave, which represents the atrial depolarization. So whenever the atria depolarizes, it's going to be followed by atrial contraction. And the P wave in the ECG, it represents the atrial depolarization. After the P wave, you have the QRS complex. Here, there was supposed to be an S. I'm going to add it later. I don't know where it's disappeared, but anyway, the QRS complex refers to the ventricular depolarization. So whenever the ventricles are depolarized, this means, and after that, the ventricles would start to contract. So that's what it means. And then we have the T wave, which basically represents ventricular repolarization, after which the ventricles would relax. Now, if you look between the QRS complex and the T wave, you have something that is called the ST segment. Now, that's kind of the period where the ventricles are between like their contraction and their relaxation. We have the ST segment, like between ventricular depolarization and repolarization. Does that make sense to you so far? Like, do you understand that? Like, do you know these ECG basics? Yes, okay, perfect. Now we're going to move to talk about the cardiac cycle. Before we go into the details, we need to also understand what does it mean? Like, what does it mean whenever someone says cardiac cycle? So the cardiac cycle is kind of sequence of events that keep happening over and over again every time the heart beats. So with every heartbeat, everything that we're going to study, subhanAllah, happens every time the heart beats, which is crazy because our heart beats a lot. Like in arresting a human, the heartbeats are around 75 beats per minute on average. So that means this happens 75 times a minute. This is how the heart is so fascinating, subhanAllah. Each cardiac cycle takes on average in a resting human around 0.8 seconds. So just keep in mind that all of these events are happening as I'm talking to you right now within my heart and as you're listening. So it's like very interesting and fascinating when you think about it that way. Okay. Now we're going to start by talking about the cardiac cycle and phases. If you look at resources, they generally divide it into 4 phases, but in your lecture is divided into more phases. So I decided to explain it according to your lecture so that it's easier for you guys to comprehend the lecture. But generally speaking, it's the big 2 chunks are systole, and then we have subdivisions of systole, and then diastole, and then we have subdivisions of diastole. So it's important to also understand where are we now? Like, where do we start? Whenever someone says the cardiac cycle, we have to be starting somewhere because it's like a cycle of events that are happening over and over again. So there isn't really a start point, like a cutoff start point or a cutoff end point. No, it's a cycle. So just to make it easier, let's imagine that we're starting mid to late ventricular diastole. So now in diastole, the ventricles are relaxing, they're not pumping blood, they're not contracting. So this is where we are right now, where the ventricles are relaxing. Specifically speaking, we're at the point where the mitral valve is open. Now, the mitral valve is the valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle, or even حتى the tricuspid valve, it's both. The cardiac cycle refers to both left and right. Where the tricuspid valve is open, which is between the right atrium and the right ventricles, okay? So we're at the point where the AV valves or the mitral valve is open. So now blood is moving down from the atria to the ventricles, and the ventricles are filling with blood. Do you understand where we are? Like, I want you to understand the start point. نحن at the point where the valve is open and blood is filling the ventricles. This is where we're going to start the cycle, because it's a cycle. There's no exact start point, but just for the sake of explanation, this is where we're starting, okay? Okay, perfect. Now, this is represented on the ECG as the TP segment. Now, what is the TP segment? If you go back to the ECG slide, so we had this ECG. Let me just take my pen. Now let's imagine that after the QRS complex and the T wave, we had another like P wave and then QRS and so on. Now let's say this is the P. So the TP segment is this segment here between ventricular repolarization and then atrial depolarization. So it's the point in between. Like the ventricles have relaxed, but the atria still did not depolarize. It's like the point in between. Do you understand where we are right now? So like the ventricles are relaxing, the atria still did not contract. It's just the mitral valve is open and the blood's flowing down the ventricles. Do you understand where we are right now? Because the beginning point can be kind of confusing. طبعا you'll understand it more. Okay, yes, you understand. Perfect. You'll understand it more as we go in the cycle because I'm going to go back to it again, inshallah. Okay, so we understand that. Now, this point is called the rapid ventricular filling. And the reason it's called rapid ventricular filling, I want you to imagine that you have kind of a tube that's filled with water, and then you're pouring the water down. So when you're pouring it down, initially the water would flow so fast, and that's because we have a huge pressure gradient. So the water would go down so fast, and the last bit of like water would just go down more slowly. It still goes down, and there is still a pressure gradient, but because the pressure gradient gets less, so the last bit of blood goes down slower. نحن at the point in the beginning where the mitral valve just opened and the blood's going down so fast, that's why we call it the rapid ventricular filling, because the blood is going down actually so fast. And then following the rapid ventricular filling, just like the same example, where like the blood would now move down slower, and that's because there is still a pressure gradient, it's just less, and that's because blood just moved down. يعني خلاص we have less blood in the atria, so less blood would move down, but it's moving down. Still, it's moving down just slower. Like it's the same exact thing, and we're still in the TP segment on the ECG. Now, one important thing to mention here is that everything I've mentioned so far, the blood is moving down the ventricles passively. What does passively mean? It means without any contraction. It's simply due to pressure gradients, because we said the atria get filled with blood. يعني, let's say the right atrium is filled with blood from the superior and the inferior vena cava. So now it has a lot of blood. So this means there's a higher pressure in the atria than in the ventricles. So now the valve would open, blood would go down from the right atrium to the right ventricle. And it makes total sense because, or for example, let's say the left atrium حتى, like it's filling with blood from the pulmonary veins, and then now it's filled with blood. So now there's high pressure in the left atrium compared to the left ventricle, so the mitral valve would open. So like it's the same concept where the atrial pressure is higher than the ventricular pressure, so the valve would open passively. For now, nothing's contracting. So we talked about the passive, now let's talk about the active. Now, 80% of the blood have already moved down. 80% of the blood moves down passively without any contractions. It's just passively moving due to pressure gradient. Now, the last bit of blood is now when the atria begin to contract. Now, I want you to imagine the heart, and now we have the two atria. Now, blood has moved down passively, but the remaining 20 to 30% of blood did not move down yet. So what happens is the atria begins to contract, because we were in the TP segment in the ECG, remember? Now we're going to move after the TP segment to the P wave. Okay, so now we're at the P wave where the atria has depolarized and now it's contracting. So now the atrial contraction means basically the atria would contract and it would squeeze, literally squeeze the last bit of blood from the atria down the ventricles. As it's squeezing the blood, خلاص, now the atria is now خلاص, like losing all the blood that it has and moving it down to the ventricles. Now, this makes total sense for us to understand, and whenever the atria does not have blood anymore and the blood has moved down the ventricles, by default, the ventricular pressure at this point would be higher, or like at a bit later than atrial contraction. So it contracts, squeezes the blood, and then the ventricular pressure becomes higher. And now because the ventricular pressure is higher than the atrial pressure, the AV valves would close. Okay? I'm going to take your questions, but first let me explain it on the cardiac cycle so that it makes sense to you. نحن we said, and I'm going to repeat everything that I explained. نحن we said we're at the point, okay, let me first orient you. So here we have the heart sounds. So we have the first, second heart sound, which I'm going to explain later. And then here we have the ECG, this is the P wave, the QRS complex, and then the T wave. And here we have the ventricular volume. Ventricular volume meaning how much blood is present within the ventricles. In the color red, we have the ventricular volume. And you can see that it's like goes up and down, and we're going to explain why it does so. And then in the blue here, we have the ventricular pressure. And in the gray, we have the atrial pressure. And then the gray on top is the aortic pressure. Now let's start at the atrial pressure. So we're at the point where here, like here, we can see that the atrial pressure in gray is greater than the ventricular pressure in blue. And that makes sense because we said we're at the point where it's mid to late ventricular diastole, the mitral valve is open, and we said it's only open whenever the atrial pressure is greater than the ventricular pressure, which is the case here. It is greater. So now the valve is open and the blood is flowing down to the ventricles. Now, if you look at the ventricular volume, you can see that the volume is increasing. And the reason it's increasing because the valve is open and it's filling with blood. So the ventricular volume will keep increasing because it's filling with blood. And we said eventually the ventricles would keep like filling with blood, and the last bit of diastole, what happens is that the atria contracts, and this is responsible for the slight increase in pressure here. And the atria contracts, squeeze the blood down the ventricles, and now that's the last bit of blood moving from the atria to the ventricles. At this point, خلاص the ventricles filled with blood, like that's the maximum blood the ventricles fill with, and now it's like almost full. All the blood that came to the heart is now at the ventricles. And now we said the ventricular pressure, because it's now full of blood, would be higher than the atrial pressure, and we can see it here. And here where the AV valve, or like the mitral valve, for example, would close. Why does it close? Because we said the ventricular pressure at this point is greater than the atrial pressure. And to correlate it to the ECG as well, now we have the P wave, which is the atrial depolarization. Now you see that the atrial contraction here happens a bit later than the atrial depolarization, and that's how it goes. Because subhanAllah, in the heart, you need the electricity to happen first, and then the mechanics to happen after. So electricity is the depolarization, so the atria depolarizes. After the depolarization is done, now the atria can contract. So like you can see the P wave happens initially, and then the atria would contract just right after. Okay, so this is where we are right now. Do you understand everything I've explained so far? If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to repeat, but I want you to understand like the first part so we can continue. Like, do you have any questions about this? Clear? Perfect. Okay. This first part, and we understand how like the blood has moved from the atria to the ventricles, and now the ventricular pressure is greater, and now we close the mitral valve because the ventricular pressure is greater. After that, we're going to move to a phase that is called the isovolumetric contraction. Now, let's break down the word. Iso means equal. Volumetric is the volume blood contraction. So what it's trying to tell you here is that the ventricles, because we said whenever it's not specified, we're talking about the ventricles. What it's trying to tell you is that the ventricles are contracting, but the volume within the ventricles is not changing. And the reason why, because at this point, the ventricles are kind of contracting in a closed loop. What that means is it's contracting while the aortic and the mitral valve are both closed. So no blood's coming in and no blood's coming out. It's just contracting. So at this particular point, the aortic pressure is still higher than the ventricular pressure, but the ventricles would keep contracting and contracting and contracting till it exceeds the aortic pressure so that it can continue. Now, before it exceeds, that's the period where we call it the isovolumetric contraction. Now, can you please think, I want you to engage it in your head so that makes more sense rather than me straightly telling you. What does isovolumetric contraction represent on an ECG? Because we said now the ventricles are contracting. So what does that show as on the ECG? Like, what does it show? Ventricles are contracting. QRS, exactly. So it shows as QRS complex. Because now we said we just finished the P wave, the atria contracted, moved down the blood. And it makes sense, because the blood moved down the ventricles. We closed the valve. Now the ventricles are going to contract. Now, in order for them to contract, we need electricity in the heart, and that's represented by QRS complex. So we're going to see QRS complex in the ECG. The ventricles begin to contract. The volume does not change. Why? Because both valves are closed. And blood can't come in and can't go out. So it makes sense, and of course the volume does not change. But the pressure, however, it keeps increasing. Why is that? Because it's like the ventricles are contracting. So they're like the muscles are moving, and this increases the pressure, which is the principle that I explained earlier. Whenever a chamber is contracting, it increases the pressure. Now for the C wave, this part here, I'm gonna explain it later. I have a slide for the waves, the venous waves, but no, just keep in mind that the C wave occurs in the isovolumetric contraction, but that's something I'm gonna explain later. Now let's see how this looks on an ECG. Actually, let me explain it here where I already explained. So we said, we've closed the AV valve, right? Let's see where the isovolumetric contraction falls. So we said we have a QRS complex on the ECG, and that's where the QRS complex is. The first sound already has happened because we've closed the AV valve. Then the QRS complex, now the ventricles begin to contract. If you look at the ventricular pressure here in blue, you see that the pressure is increasing, like it's going up, 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 and that makes sense because the ventricles are contracting. If you look at the volume is a straight line. The ventricular volume is straight. It does not change. And that's because the valves are both closed, blood's not coming in, and it's not going out. So the volume remains the same. If you compare it here, that's the period of isovolumetric contraction, these two closed lines. If you look here, the ventricular pressure is still lower than the aortic valve pressure. That's the aortic valve in gray. And the ventricular pressure is still a bit lower. So it makes sense why both valves are closed, because it's higher than the AV valve, but however, it's still lower than the aortic, but the ventricles are contracting and contracting until it reaches a point where it exceeds the aortic valve pressure. Now, let's see the rapid ventricular ejection. Now, the word ejection should tell you إنه خلاص blood is being ejected, يعني it's moving from the ventricle to the aorta. طبعا when does that happen? When the ventricular pressure finally exceeds the aortic pressure. So I'm just going to explain it here again, and then I'm going to go back to the slide. So we've reached a point here where the ventricular pressure exceeds the aortic valve pressure. So now the aortic valve would open. طبعا, do we see a heart sound? No. Why? Because the heart sounds are associated with any valve closing. It's not associated with valve opening. So the aortic valve opening does not generate a heart sound. So now the aortic valve is opened. Now the ventricular pressure would keep going up. حتى the aortic pressure would keep going up. Why do both pressure go up? Because the ventricles are contracting even more and it's ejecting blood, so that requires more pressure within the chamber, so the pressure would increase. And the aortic pressure is increasing because it's now taking blood. The aorta is now receiving blood. So obviously the pressure within the aorta would increase. Now, if you look at the ventricular volume at this point, you're going to see that the volume is decreasing. Why is that? Because now blood is moving from the ventricles to the aorta. So the ventricles are now losing the blood or ejecting the blood to the aorta. So the ventricular volume would start to drop, drop, drop. And similar concept, we have rapid ejection phase and a slower ejection phase, which are practically the same thing, but no, because we have less pressure gradient. Pressure gradient is still there, but initially it's so high. So that's like there is rapid ejection. And then it gets a bit slower, and it's because there is still pressure gradient, just not as high as before. And then eventually, خلاص, the volume would go down as low as possible. Now let me just read the slide to make sure I said everything. طبعا this is represented as an ST segment on the ECG. We said the ST is between the QRS complex and the T wave. It's between the depolarization and the repolarization. So the ventricles did not relax yet, so they're still contracting. So that's like between the depolarization and repolarization. It makes sense. The ventricular pressure increasing. Yeah, we said that. The aortic valve opens, volume decreases. We've seen that. Arterial pressure and volume rises. We've seen that as well. And the pulmonary trunk on the right side of the heart would also fill with ejected blood. Because remember, the cardiac cycle is for both sides of the heart. So on the left, the aorta would be filled in, with blood, and on the right side, the pulmonary trunk would be filled with blood. Do you understand everything I've said so far on the ejection phase? Or do you guys have any questions? Yes, perfect. Okay. Now, the slow ventricular ejection is very similar, except now we're going to start to see the T wave, where the ventricles begin to kind of repolarize and begin to relax, and the ventricular ejection slows. The pressures begin to drop. We've seen that in the cardiac cycle. And the volume decreases further as ejection nears completion. We also seen that near the volumes, and we've seen the volume begins to drop to almost like nothing. We begin to see the T wave on the ECG complex. The aortic and the left ventricular pressure, even like they also begin to fall because it was very high in the beginning because they had a lot of blood and the ventricles were like ejecting the blood intensely, and then خلاص, it begins to like slow down because it has no more blood and because the T wave begins to happen. So that's like the slow ventricular ejection. After this, the slow ventricular ejection, we're going to have the isovolumetric relaxation. Now, what's isovolumetric relaxation? I know we've broken down the word isovolumetric already. Let me go back to the first one. Yes. So isovolumetric is the point where the volume does not change. You can see here, the volume of the ventricles do not change. So that's easy. We know that the volume is not changing whenever we hear the word isovolumetric. Now, relaxation, it means the ventricles are now relaxed. طبعا this happens after repolarization. So the T wave would happen first. We said in electricity, then mechanics. The T wave would happen first, so the ventricles repolarize, and then they begin to relax. If you look here, the ventricular pressure begins to drop, and it's dropping because it's relaxing. It's no longer contracting. And as it's dropping, خلاص, now at this point, the ventricular pressure, or even before the ventricular pressure gets here, it gets lower than the aortic pressure. And for this reason, the aortic valve would close at this point. And it's important for it to close لأنه خلاص, the aorta has received the blood, there are no more blood in the ventricles, or there is still blood, but it's like very minimal. So now خلاص, the aortic pressure is higher, so the valve would close, and now we have both valves closed. So at this point, that's when we have the isovolumetric relaxation. So the ventricular pressure is dropping, the aortic valve is closed, the mitral valve is still closed, it did not open yet, the volume is not changing, and this happened following the T wave. Now we said the aortic valve closed, and we said whenever a valve closes, this means it's going to generate a heart sound. So that's when we hear the second heart sound, or S2. S2 happens when the aortic valve closes. S1, we've seen it when the mitral or the AV valve have closed, that's the S1. S2 خلاص, now when the aortic valve is closed, that's when you hear the second heart sound, and then following that, we're going to see the isovolumetric relaxation. Do you understand everything I've said so far? Or do you have any questions? I'm going to keep checking up, you guys understand, because in case you don't, I'm more than happy to repeat. And it's better to ask now than later. So you have the full picture clear. Okay, perfect. Let me just check. The V wave is also something I'm going to explain. I'm going to explain later when I explain the waves that I told you about. But now there's a concept that I want you to understand. I'm not sure if you took it in another lecture. You probably did, but I'll just explain it in case. Now, there is a notch that appears on the aortic pressure curve due to the Wind-Kessel effect. Now, what's the Wind-Kessel effect? It basically means, subhanAllah, the arteries, as you probably already know, are so elastic, particularly the aorta. It's such an elastic artery, which means, whenever the blood is ejected into the aorta, it can like stretch to accommodate all the blood that's coming in. So the aorta would stretch to accommodate for the increase in volume that's happening in the aorta. And whenever the ventricles stop contracting, and the aorta would want to move the blood to all our body, صح? We usually would need a contraction for that. Like, how would you move the blood if the ventricles are not contracting? SubhanAllah, the elasticity of the aorta would allow that to happen because it was stretching to accommodate the blood. And now once the ventricles, I have a question. I'll explain it inshallah once I'm done with this point. Okay. So خلاص, the ventricles are not pumping blood. So we said the aorta is now stretching. It has already stretched and it's accommodated the blood. Then what's going to happen is, because it's such an elastic artery, it's going to kind of recoil back to its normal size. And due to this recoiling force, it will push the blood forward and allow the blood to move to all our body. So that's what the Wind-Kessel effect means. Like, that's the whole principle of the Wind-Kessel effect. So the question says, could you quickly repeat the movement of the blood till now? Sure. But I don't really get your question. Do you mean on the cardiac cycle, the curves, how the blood is moving? No, just tell me what. Oh, yes? Okay, perfect. Okay, I'll explain that. So I'll repeat just the blood flow from the beginning so you guys have the full picture. So initially we said we were in the mid to late ventricular diastole. So we're at the point where the mitral valve is open. This is where we're starting, because we said it's a cycle, and so there's no cutoff starting point and no cutoff end point. So I'm just going to choose this point to explain, okay? We're at the point where the mitral valve is open and the blood is moving passively without any contraction from the atria down the ventricles, because there is pressure gradient, because all the blood, we said, it comes to the atria, like from our body, from the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, the blood would go to the right atrium. So now the pressure within the right atrium increases because it has a lot of blood. And this pressure gradient between the right atrium and the right ventricle would open the valve, which is the AV valve. And now as the AV valve opens, blood would move passively from the atria to the ventricles. And if you see here, looking at the red, which is the ventricular volume, meaning the blood within the ventricles, you're going to see, it's increasing. Let me just delete everything or erase on my HUD so I can show you again. Okay. So you're going to see that the ventricular volume is increasing, and that's because the blood is moving down to the ventricles. And if you look here, you're going to see that the atrial pressure in gray is greater than the ventricular pressure in blue, and that's because it's full with blood. It makes sense. And the last bit of pressure here, you're going to see, the pressure is increasing within the atria even more, and that's because at the end of it, like the last 20 to 30% of the blood in the atria moves down actively, meaning the atria would contract to squeeze the blood down the ventricles, and you're going to see that the blood would keep increasing up until this point. Eventually, because the blood has moved from the because blood has now moved from the atria to the ventricles, so now the ventricular pressure becomes even higher, and this will cause the AV valve to close, because now the ventricular pressure is higher because all the blood's now in the ventricles. We squeeze it down. And now the closure of the AV valve would generate the first heart sound, which is S1. Okay? And طبعا to correlate it to the ECG before the atria contracts, it's correlated to the P wave on the ECG. Is that clear so far? I want you to tell me if you're understanding. Got it, thank you. Okay. Do you need, I was going to continue. Do you need me to continue the other volumes? Well, is that it? Is that what you needed? That was it? Okay, perfect. Okay, so to remind you guys where we were at the point where the aortic valve was closed, there was isovolumetric contraction, the pressure was dropping, and we've seen in خلاص the isovolumetric relaxation and the volume does not change within the ventricles. This is where we were, okay? And yeah, we're done. That's it actually. It's gonna go back again. Okay, I'm gonna repeat everything so that makes sense. So we were at the point, what I explained to the question, and خلاص, we've reached a point where the AV valve has closed and now there was isovolumetric contraction, so the pressure in the ventricles would go up, the volume does not change. And then before the contraction, obviously we have the QRS complex on the ECG. Eventually, the ventricular pressure would exceed the aortic pressure, so the aortic valve would open. Now blood gets ejected from the ventricles to the aorta. You can see both pressures are going up because the ventricles are contracting so hard, and because the aorta is now accommodating blood, so this will increase the pressure within the aorta. Then this will be followed by a slower ejection phase because the pressure gradient is not as high as before, but there's still ejection. Eventually, the ventricular pressure becomes lower than the aortic pressure, so the aortic valve would close. طبعا this closure is associated with the second heart sound, which is S2. Before the ventricles relax, we're going to see on the ECG the T wave, which represents ventricular repolarization. طبعا we're going fast because I'm just repeating everything. If you guys need me to go slower, please tell me. Anyway, so the T wave represents ventricular repolarization, after which the ventricles would relax. So you're going to see the ventricular pressure is dropping. It goes down, 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 down. And then eventually, because the ventricular pressure gets lower, plus now we finished the cycle, we're going to repeat it again. The ventricular pressure gets lower than the atrial pressure. Now the AV valve would open. And now we're going to repeat the cycle. The AV valve is open, blood would move from the atria to the ventricles, and so on. So the cycle would repeat again. And we said this whole thing takes place within 0.8 seconds for a relaxing person, like at rest. Do you understand everything so far? If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to repeat. So this is basically what's happening in the cardiac cycle. And one heartbeat. Thank you, of course. If you guys have any questions, I can repeat. Clear? Perfect. Now I'm going to move to the venous pressure waves that I explained to you, that I told you I'm going to explain later before. So if you look at this graph, these are the venous pressure waves. So we have 3 waves, which are the A, C, and V waves, and then we have 2 descents, which are the X and Y descents. طبعا this is measuring the changes in pressure within our venous system. طبعا just to remind you, in our hearts, subhanAllah, a lot of things are happening simultaneously. A lot of things are connected. It's not like a chamber is like completely isolated from the veins or it's not like it's isolated from the other chamber. No. In the heart, everything's connected. And this applies to the concept where we said, no, the blood comes from the superior and the inferior vena cava to the right atrium. So that's where we apply this concept. And the right atrium is somehow connected to the venous system because that's where the venous system drains. Yani, it makes sense, صح? So I'm going to start by talking about the A wave. Now, if you look at the A wave, it basically corresponds to atrial contraction. Remember how we said at the end of ventricular diastole, as it's filling with blood, the atria would contract to squeeze the last bit of blood? Now, as the atria contracts to squeeze the last bit of blood, it's going to increase the pressure within the venous system. And this makes sense because we said whenever something's contracting, it's generating more pressure. And because the atria is connected to the venous system, the pressure would also increase in the venous system. So that's basically what's happening. So that's why the A waves appear. I think all you need to know is understand what's the reason behind this increase in pressure in the venous system. So the reason why the A wave happens, it's because the atria is contracting. Like it's due to atrial contraction, which will kind of increase the pressure within the venous system as well. And then following the A wave, we're going to have the C wave. Now, the C wave would happen during the period of isovolumetric contraction where like both valves are closed. Now, even though both valves are closed, when the ventricles are contracting, I want you to imagine the right ventricle. Let me just see if I can illustrate it to you, but yeah, okay. So look at this heart here. So we have the right atrium and we have the right ventricle. So what's happening here is that let's imagine that both valves are closed. Yani this valve and the valve, this is the AV valve and the valve that's leading to the pulmonary trunk. So both valves are closed and the right ventricle is contracting. Now imagine if there's a lot of blood and the ventricles are contracting, it kind of pushes the tricuspid valve upwards because there is a lot of blood. Now when it pushes it upward, it will push it to the right atrium, which will increase the pressure in the venous system. Like, does that make sense? And it's contracting, so it pushes the valve. So this overall, like because the tricuspid valve is attached to the right atrium, this will overall increase the pressure in the venous system, and that's why we'd have the C wave. Like, I hope this like makes sense in your head. You know, the ventricles are contracting, it kind of pushes the tricuspid valve, even though the valve is closed, but because there's contraction. So this will increase the pressure in the atria, which will increase the pressure in the venous pressure waves. I hope this makes sense. Now for the V wave, basically it reflects the atrial filling. Now, if you can see during systole where the ventricles are contracting, because we said everything's happening simultaneously, as the ventricles are contracting, the atria at the same time are filling with blood from the superior and the inferior vena cava. So now because the atria is filling with blood, any filling blood would increase the pressure, and that's what V wave means. طبعا after like the V wave, you're gonna see the descent is there, like the Y descent, and now because the atria initially like fills with blood from the entire body, and then eventually it'll eject the blood down the ventricle, so the pressure would again drop, which is why we have a Y descent. Now for like one last time, A wave represents atrial contraction, and then you're gonna have the C wave, which is the bulging of the tricuspid valve into the atrium during right ventricular systole, which I explained like, on this heart model here. And then we're gonna have the X descent, which is due to the relaxation of the atrium. And the descents are so easy to remember, it's just the opposite of what was happening. And initially we had contraction, and then the descent after would be relaxation. And then here we had the V wave due to like due to filling of the atria, and then the Y descent would be due to emptying the atria down to the blood down the ventricles. Do you understand that part? And because we're talking about the venous system, it's usually referring to the right side of the heart because that's where the veins drain. Do you understand the venous pressure waves or like the reason behind them? Yes? Okay, perfect. Now I have two questions for you for the cardiac cycle before we move into the pressure volume loops. Can someone, or can you all actually answer? And you take your time to think. Because it says immediately after. So I'm receiving like answers on my direct message, but I want you to guys think before I say them. Okay. So all of you answered E, which is bravo, it is the correct answer. So immediately after a QRS wave, we would have isovolumetric contraction. طبعا the reason why it's not B, because if you look at the cardiac cycle, we would initially have like the isovolumetric contraction, which after we would have the ejection. So immediately after, this is wrong, obviously. Immediately after, it's going to be the isovolumetric contraction. So bravo, all of you answered it correctly. Now, can you please try to answer the other question? So I'm receiving two different answers. I'll just give a chance for everyone to answer, then I'll explain why the right answer is the right answer. Okay, so I received E and B. The correct answer is E. It's the aortic valve closing. هلا B would be correct if it was at the beginning of the ventricular ejection, but it says at the end of the period of ventricular ejection, which is the reason why it's the aortic valve closing. Because after the ejection, like if you look at the cardiac cycle, so that makes more sense to you. Like after the ejection, خلاص we're done with ejecting the blood. يعني make it make sense in your head. Imagine the ventricles are ejecting the blood. يعني the aortic valve is already open. Like it's not at the end, it's at the beginning. In order for the ventricles to be able to eject the blood, the aortic valve must be open. So that happens in the beginning of the ejection phase where the aortic valve opens, and then it ejects the blood, ejects the blood, ejects the blood. At the end, خلاص the blood's already ejected, the aortic valve gets higher, and then the aortic valve would close. So at the end of ejection, we would have the aortic valve closing. Does that make sense? Like, do you understand why it's not B? Or like, do you need clear? Okay, perfect. Now, if you have any questions regarding the cardiac cycle, please do and ask me. Because now I'm going to start with the pressure volume loops, which is actually very easy. If you understand the cardiac cycle, it even gets 10 times easier. If you feel like it's hard in the beginning, that's normal. Like, this is how I felt like the first time I studied the lecture, but trust me, with time, well, it gets like so easy and it gets like one of your favorite lectures in cardio. Inshallah, يعني. Okay, since no one has any questions, I'm going to go ahead and explain the pressure volume loops. Now, if you look at the pressure volume loops overall, it can look pretty intimidating for someone who's just looking at the picture because there are a lot of words and there are like a lot of information in like one little diagram. So let's break it down together. Inshallah, try to make it easier. So we have a y-axis and an x-axis. On the y-axis, we have the left ventricular pressure. And on the x-axis, we have the left ventricular volume, meaning the amount of blood. طبعا pressure volume loops, unlike the cardiac cycle, it refers to the left side of the heart. So it talks about the left atrium, it talks about the left ventricle, it talks about the mitral valve, it talks about the aortic valve, but it does not talk about the right side of the heart. It mainly discusses what's happening on the left side of the heart, okay? So that's something to keep in mind. Now, I've highlighted half of the loop in yellow and the other half in like this pinkish orangish color. That's because what's in yellow represents the systole or the contraction of the ventricles. And what's in the pinkish color, it is like the diastole or the ventricular relaxation. Now let's start talking about the pressure volume loop point by point in a very similar way that we discussed in the cardiac cycle. So we're going to start here. We remove like all this mess and let's start at one word and let's study it word by word so that it makes sense in our head and let's build it together. Okay? So the first thing I want you to notice is that we have 4 points. We have the point A, we have the point B, C, and D. طبعا one important note is that you need to know the names of these points and you need to know what they mean. Because in the exam, they can ask you, what does A represent in a pressure volume loop? Or what's happening between A and B? Or what's C? Or what's D? So you need to know the letters, okay? Like, no, this is A, this is B, this is C, and this is D. And all you need to know is like, what's the starting point? Just know, this is A, خلاص, you'd know the rest, okay? Okay. So remember when I explained the cardiac cycle, I said we're at the point where the mitral valve is open and now blood is moving down from the atria to the ventricles. I'm going to explain it in a very similar way in the pressure volume loop. So now the mitral valve, which is the valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle, is open, like it opens. And as it's opening, the blood would start to flow from the atria to the ventricles, صح? So خلاص, now we know the mitral valve is open, now blood would flow. So let's see how it's flowing. Now, this is what we call diastolic filling. Why? Because now we said, this whole part here, it's diastole. So diastolic filling, it's like the ventricles are filling with blood, and you can see the volume is increasing. On the x-axis, you can see, it's moving to the right side. Like, hey, this is the direction. So this means, the volume is increasing within the ventricles, which makes total sense because the ventricles are filling with blood. And then we said at the end point where, like, the ventricles are filling with blood, like for the last 20 to 30%, the atria would contract to squeeze the last bit of blood. So that's also represented here by atrial systole. Now the atria would contract, squeeze the last bit of blood, and now it's going to fill the ventricles with blood. The end result إنه the ventricular pressure would be higher than the atrial pressure, صح? طبعا this, what does it cause? Like, what does happen when the ventricular pressure becomes greater than the atrial pressure? We said the mitral valve is open. So when the ventricular pressure exceeds the atrial pressure, what's going to happen at the point B? Can someone guess? Or like an educated guess based on what I told you.
The mitral valve will close.
Yes, exactly. Someone also sent it to my direct message. Exactly. The mitral valve will close. and that will cause the first heart sound to be generated. So we'll have S1. So we had the mitral valve open, then there was diastolic filling. Now the ventricular pressure exceeds the atrial pressure, so the mitral valve would close, and this will generate the first heart sound, S1. طبعا it's important to remember, the first heart sound occurs at the point B, or at this point, يعني just know the looks of it. I gave you my presentation in the same way I added the slide, so the best way to study it, in my opinion, and just to ask yourself what's happening next. This way, you'll be able to, inshallah, answer every question. So the mitral valve opened, diastolic filling, now the mitral valve has closed. Remember, in the cardiac cycle, we saw a period which is called the isovolumetric contraction. That's where we're moving next. So there is isovolumetric contraction. Why is it isovolumetric? Because now both valves are closed. We said the mitral valve has closed, and the pressure still did not exceed the aortic pressure, valve pressure. So the ventricles would keep contracting. And because both valves are closed, the volume does not change. And if you look at the x-axis, it's moving straight. It's not moving to the right and not to the left. And that's because both valves are closed, so the volume is not changing. Now, another important point that I need to mention for you guys is that here we have something that's called the end diastolic volume. Now, the end diastolic volume is the volume of blood that's filling the ventricle after the end of diastole, as the name indicates, end diastolic. طبعا, why is that important? لأنه end diastolic volume, it's basically telling you إنه now the ventricles are filled with the maximum amount of blood that the ventricles are filled throughout the entire cardiac cycle or throughout the entire PV loop. This is the highest amount of blood that the ventricles are filled with. You can see there's nothing after this end diastolic volume, nothing is after that. This is the highest volume. This is in contrast to the end systolic volume, which I will explain later, inshallah. But for now, remember, end diastolic volume, it happens after the mitral valve closes, and it's at the point where isovolumetric contraction is happening. We're at end diastolic volume. And now the ventricles are filled with the maximum amount of blood, which makes total sense because we still did not eject the blood, and we just closed the mitral valve after filling the ventricles. So now they're full of blood, okay? Now, the ventricles would keep contracting, and if you look at the y-axis, you're going to see the pressure is increasing, and that's due to the contraction. طب, can someone tell me what do you think would happen at point C after the ventricles keep contracting and increasing their pressure, particularly the left ventricle? It's contracting and contracting. So what's going to happen?
The aortic valve will open.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So at the point C, you're going to see the aortic valve's opening, and that's because the ventricular pressure has exceeded the aortic valve pressure. And now once the aortic valve opens, now we're going to start with ejection, because now the valve is open. This will allow blood to be ejected from the ventricles to the aorta. So ejection will increase the pressure within the ventricles, as you can see, because it's contracting a lot. Not only that, but also the volume is going to be decreased, which makes total sense because now the blood is no longer in the ventricles, it's moving to the aorta. So you're going to see the volume, because this is where it's moving, this is the direction. The volume is decreasing. We're going the other way on the x-axis. So that's what's happening after systolic ejection. Now, eventually, the blood will move from the ventricles to the aorta, and now the aorta is filled with blood. Now the pressure within the aorta is higher than the pressure in the ventricles. So can you tell me what happens at point D, based on what I said? I want you to comprehend in your head.
The aortic valve will close.
Exactly. The aortic valve would close, and this will generate the second heart sound, or S2. Okay? And you should see, mashallah, guys, while I'm asking you, you guys are already answering it, whether you're sending it to my direct or thank you, Rent, for answering. So all of you, and you can already comprehend it in your head if you understand how it's moving. It can look intimidating once you look at it hike, but when you start building it in your head, it makes total sense. Now, both valves are closed, so we're going to move to another period of isovolumetric. But this time, it's not contraction, it's going to be isovolumetric relaxation. And you're going to see the ventricular pressure begin to drop until the mitral valve opens, because the atrial pressure would exceed the ventricular pressure. And then it goes all over again. Now, another important point I'm going to explain is that at the end of isovolumetric relaxation, there is the end systolic volume. Now, what's the end systolic volume? I mentioned earlier, the ventricles would contract and they will eject the blood, and most of the blood, the majority of the blood will be ejected from the ventricles to the aorta. However, a minimal amount of blood would stay within the ventricles. It's not 100% ejection. Some blood would remain within the ventricles. It does not eject the entire amount of blood that's there. Now, the minimal amount of blood that remains within the ventricles, that's what we call the end systolic volume. If you break down the words, it makes sense. End systolic, after systole, after contraction, the volume that's remaining after that. So that's ASV, or end systolic volume. And we said end diastolic volume is the maximum amount of blood. Did you guys take the stroke volume? Like, do you know what a stroke volume is? You probably did, I think. I'm not sure. Did you guys take it?
Yes,
Yes, okay. So can someone tell me what a stroke volume is?
it's the difference between the end diastolic volume and the end systolic volume.
Exactly. Or in other words, it's the amount of blood that's ejected in a single heartbeat, صح? So you can actually calculate the stroke volume from a pressure volume loop. The way you do that, you're going to look at the x-axis. Like imagine if it was numbered. Let's say this end diastolic volume was 100. And then the end systolic volume was, for example, a 40. So you're going to be able to calculate the stroke volume. You're going to say it's 100 minus 40, and this will give you the stroke volume. And the stroke volume represents like this space within the PV loop. This whole thing, it represents like the stroke volume and like the work of the heart. So that's what's representing what's inside the PV loop, like this space inside. So that's another thing that you can do from pressure volume loop is that you can actually calculate the stroke volume. And that's it, guys. Like that's literally it for a pressure volume loop. It's actually so easy if you build it in your head and if you relate it to what you already studied in the cardiac cycle. Does anyone have any questions regarding the pressure volume loops? Is it clear, guys? All clear? Okay, perfect. Yes, perfect. Now, these are just words for what I explained to you in case you guys want to use my slides. And now this is something that I found in your lecture, and I thought, no, let me just explain it in case you guys didn't get it. So here, the doctor is like showing you the relation between the cardiac cycle and the pressure volume loops, and just trying to correlate the points. Now, we said the A here, it represents the mitral valve opening, صح? We already studied it here. But I believe, this is like better for you to study. It has like, it's labeled and you can see it moving. It was like, in my opinion, it's easier to study than the doctor's graph, but يعني feel free طبعا to use whatever like suits you. But at the point A, now the mitral valve is opening, and it's here you can see that it's correlated to the pressure volume loop. Here at this point, it's like, imagine that the ventricular pressure is now dropping, 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 and then the mitral valve would open because the atrial pressure in black exceeds the ventricular pressure in red. So now the mitral valve opens. At this point, it is diastole. So if you look at the left ventricular volume, the volume is increasing because the valve is open, and now the ventricles are filling with blood. Eventually, what's going to happen, we're going to reach a point of B where the ventricular pressure is greater than the atrial pressure, so the mitral valve, so the mitral valve would close, so we're going to hear the first heart sound. And then after that, there will be isovolumetric contraction, which is like from point B to C. So that's the isovolumetric contraction. The volume does not change. However, the pressure keeps increasing. And then at the point C, now the aortic valve would open because the ventricular pressure is greater. So you're going to see this is the period of ejection, which is also here, like this is the point where the aortic valve would open, and then this is the ejection. And then following the ejection, the aortic valve would close because it's greater, the pressure is greater than the ventricular pressure. And then the phase 4, or at this point, it's like representing the isovolumetric relaxation, which is here represented by here. And you can see the pressure in the ventricles are dropping and the volume is not changing. Okay, do you see the relation between them both, or do you have any questions regarding it? Do you guys understand? Because I went pretty fast, just because I just explained it. But if you need me to repeat, I'm more than happy to do so. Clear? Okay, perfect. Okay, now I have 2 questions for you guys regarding the pressure volume loops. Can you try to answer them? Okay, so all of you said A, and it's the right answer. So when does the second heart sound occur? It does occur at point D, where the aortic valve closes. Bravo. Okay, can you try to answer this? Okay, so I received answers in my direct message. All of them are correct, inshallah. Just give it a little bit of time for whoever wants to think. B, exactly. So the answer is B. The lowest ventricular volume occurs at the end systolic volume, which is like the minimum amount of blood remaining after full systole. Okay, that's it, guys, for our lecture. I hope you guys benefited, inshallah. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. It's present on like the first slides in my presentation. And please scan the QR code for your feedback. Thank you for listening and have a great day, inshallah. And of course, I'm more than happy to help. Okay. I'll see you guys. Bye-bye.